When a $4,000 fine from the HOA turns into a confrontation with the cops, my wife's calm defiance catches everyone off guard. But the real shock comes when the officer recognizes her and suddenly, it's the HOA Karen who's in trouble. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into this epic story, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels. Now, grab some popcorn, because this one's going to get intense. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the letter arrived. The envelope was thick, official looking, and sealed with the familiar emblem of our HOA. I frowned when I saw it. My wife, Anne, took one glance at it and rolled her eyes. The HOA had been on our case for months over trivial matters: a hedge that was too tall, a faded mailbox that didn't match the community's aesthetic. It had all become too much, but this time, the letter felt different. We tore it open together. The fine inside was a staggering $4,000 for something as ridiculous as a small, slightly overgrown bush in our backyard. My heart raced with disbelief. There was no way I was paying that. Anne, ever the voice of reason and the strong-willed one of the pair, simply threw it aside. We're not giving them a dime. This is absurd, but the HOA Karen, Linda, the neighborhood president, had a reputation for being a bulldozer. And as we both knew, this wasn't going to be the last time we heard from her. In the days that followed, the letters came one after the other. First, a polite reminder, then a stern warning. After that, they threatened legal action. But still, Anne and I stood our ground. We'll take it to court, and said firmly, she can't just push us around. Then Linda herself started showing up at our front door. It was like clockwork. Every other day, she would pull up in her SUV, get out with her clipboard, and march up to our doorstep. Her face always wore that expression, the one that said she was on a mission to rid the world of any sign of imperfection. The first time she knocked, I opened the door. You need to address this fine immediately, she said, her voice sharp. I don't care if you think it's petty. We have rules for a reason, and you'll follow them. Or else. Anne, who had been at work, came out to see what was going on. She glanced at me and then at Linda, standing there with her arms crossed, waiting for a response. Without hesitation, Anne replied, no, Linda, we're not paying it, and we're not going to fix a bush just to satisfy your overbearing rules. Linda's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Anne turned and walked back inside, leaving Linda standing there in stunned silence. From that moment on, we knew this wasn't just about a fine. It was about power, and she was determined to use her position to make our lives miserable. A week later, things took an unexpected turn. I was in the kitchen making dinner when Anne called me outside. She's back, she said, her voice low. Linda had parked her car outside our house, and this time, she wasn't alone. I stepped outside and watched as Linda marched up our driveway, her eyes wild with frustration. She didn't even knock this time. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began dialing. I saw her mouth the words, I'm calling the police. I raised an eyebrow. The police? For a bush? Anne wasn't fazed. Let her. I'm not scared of her. Let's see how this goes. Linda was on the phone for a few minutes, pacing back and forth. Then she hung up. They'll be here soon, she declared. You'll see what happens when you refuse to comply with the rules. The anticipation was thick in the air as we waited for the officer to arrive. Honestly, I didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't help but feel that Linda had finally crossed the line. Minutes later, a police car pulled up to the curb. Anne and I exchanged looks. Well, here we go, I muttered. The officer was a tall man in his 30s. He stepped out of the car with a calm demeanor, giving both Linda and us a quick once-over. Before he made his way toward us, Linda immediately rushed to him, pointing to the small bush in our yard and explaining, in great detail, how we were flagrantly violating HOA rules. Her voice was loud, authoritative, like she was the one holding the badge. Anne and I stood quietly as the officer listened to her complaints. He looked at the bush, then at Linda, and then back at us. The tension in the air was palpable. I could feel my wife's coolness in the face of the confrontation. She had her arms folded across her chest, ready to handle whatever came next. I stood there, trying to read the officer's expression, but when he glanced over at Anne again, his expression changed. There was recognition in his eyes. Wait a second, the officer said, squinting at her. Are you the judge, right? Anne's calm smile told me everything. Yes, I am, she replied, her voice steady. The officer froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. He took a step back, as if processing this revelation. You live here? He asked, his voice trailing off. Linda's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. She looked back and forth between the officer and Anne, clearly rattled. She had no idea who Em was, or at least, she hadn't recognized her. But now that she knew, it was like the entire situation had flipped. The officer's demeanor shifted completely. Where he had once seemed neutral, he now appeared uncomfortable, even apologetic. Ma'am, I didn't realize. I didn't mean any disrespect, he said, turning to Anne. I'm just trying to do my job here. Anne nodded. I understand, but I'm not sure what my job title has to do with a bush that's been here for years. Linda, looking more and more flustered, opened her mouth to speak, but the officer raised his hand, stopping her in her tracks. Linda, I need to speak with you privately, he said firmly. The officer stepped aside with Linda, and for a moment, I could hear nothing but muffled voices. I couldn't make out the words, but Linda's tone was much quieter than before. There was no more shouting or threats. It was clear that the officer was explaining the situation to her in a way that she hadn't expected. When they returned, Linda was visibly shaken. The officer looked at her, his face stern. I think we've all learned something here today. First, you can't simply call the police over a landscaping issue. Second, you should know that harassment, especially when you're dealing with a judge, can have serious consequences. Linda's face paled. She stammered. I didn't mean. The officer didn't let her finish. I think you've caused enough trouble, and I'd advise you to review your behavior. Consider this a warning. The officer turned to Anne and me, offering a quiet apology. We'll take care of this on our end. The fine is null and void, and if Linda continues to harass you, don't hesitate to contact me directly. With that, the officer left, but not before giving Linda one final warning. Anne and I stood there, both a little stunned by how quickly everything had changed. As the officer drove off, we could see Linda standing at the end of the driveway, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She hadn't won this time. In the weeks that followed, things quieted down. The letters from the HOA stopped, and Linda never came by again. The fine was officially lifted, and we received a formal apology from the board. Anne and I carried on with our lives, knowing we had stood up for what was right. I often thought back to that day, not just because of the fine, but because of the way things unfolded. It wasn't about the money or the bush. It was about power, how one person with the right voice can change everything. As for Linda, I think she learned a valuable lesson that day. Sometimes it's not the power you hold over others that matters. It's the respect you show them, and that, in the end, is far more valuable than any fine or rule.